So Dave, we did a bit of work recently together, you and I, about students' digital experiences, and one of the things I know you really picked out from that is how much of students' digital practice is in a slightly grey area of legitimacy, if you like, that they kind of hide an awful lot of what they really do with their devices, with their services. Do you want to just say a little bit more about how you theorise that?
Yeah, I think what happens is that students, for whatever reason, get a sense from their institution, perhaps even that they've just made it up from sort of cultural influences, about what higher education is and what it means to be, what legitimate practice looks like in higher education. Sometimes that's quite narrow, but their actual learning practice, significantly because of the way that they can now work online, their actual learning practice might be much broader than that. And so, for example, they will be going to lots of non-traditional sources. This is well known. They might be going to YouTube, Wikipedia, or all kinds of sources that perhaps they don't feel comfortable about citing or even talking about in a formal educational context. But these resources, these places that they go, they find enormously useful to actually go about learning. So I think that what happens is the web amplifies this tension between what it means to act, at least in the students' minds, credibly, in that sense, as academics, if you like, or as proto-academics, versus what they're doing to actually learn. So there's a tension between like the structures and the industry of academia and what it means to learn. And some of that's around resources. I think the other major area is around collaboration as well. So students will be meeting in Facebook groups or lurking in Twitter or in all these new digital spaces where they will actually be collaborating, sharing resources, discussing assignments. And yet when, as a researcher, you talk to them about these things, they're reticent to talk about those practices because they're worried that they might not be legitimate. They're worried that they might be seen as collusion or plagiarism. And so the students will generally, keep these things in the dark, in the shadows, and whilst they themselves as a peer group, if you like, or as a cohort might well be operating a lot in these kind of what you might call grey areas, that they will quite specifically not want to make them visible to their institution.
Yeah, a thing I've noticed as well is about recording their learning. So students will often use their personal devices or very handy apps for making notes or capturing or curating materials or capturing a scene, capturing an outcome from an experiment, for example, which they feel they ought to be taking proper notes of. And actually, they're using their mobile devices is quite a useful thing to do, but they may not necessarily feel that it is. So a lot of students' use of Evernote and curation services is quite hidden as well, I think. And their use of kind of personal devices such as cameras and audio recorders is, increasingly comes into the light of day, but has, I think, been quite hidden away. I think you and I would definitely agree that in order to provide an effective learning environment, we need to bring some of these practices into the light, and we need to acknowledge them and support them effectively. I wonder, though, if we would agree about the extent to which we need to respond as educators to those practices. So, one thing I might say in designing learning would be, well, I know that social bookmarking is a very accessible practice for students. They know how to share knowledge, they know how to tag things, they know how to tell their friends something's great. And for me, it's quite a useful stepping stone into more formal practices of referencing, tagging, kind of getting a personal overview of a field of knowledge. But on the other hand, it could be argued that, well, why do we bother to get them into the Harvard system of referencing, actually, when what we know in the digital age is that you can put in a link to something, and that's as good as recognising the person who originally contributed it anyway. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I wonder whether as institutions we're trying to do two things, or there are two things at play here, which is in some ways speaks to that what I was talking about, the tension between academia and learning. So I think it is important to be honest and to say higher education institutions are designed to deliver sort of academic learning, and that has certain structures, certain ways of legitimizing and validating things, and clearly we would be being disingenuous to our students if we pretended that wasn't the case. But I think there's another thing that's going on that's being amplified by the web. I think it's always been there, but it's amplified by the web, which is that students perhaps also want to go out into the world feeling like they've got a legitimate voice in their discipline or in their chosen profession. And I'd argue that the mechanisms, the language, the dialect, the places where you become legitimate or you start to develop that voice, that persona in your field or when you're traveling in a certain professional direction, that's slightly in parallel to what it takes to do the academia.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking of what Professor Nutbeam at Southampton said recently, which is that when I think he called it a digital portfolio professionally managed is more valuable than a degree grade. So I think you're kind of pushing in that direction, aren't you? You're saying, well, in fact, we need to encourage students to begin to develop that digital portfolio of what they can do, whether that's professional, academic, vocational, and to manage it professionally. And that should be part of their learning. And in some ways, if we don't do that, we've kind of failed if we just give them a little certificate saying, this is what you're good at. But that does seem to me to have different resonances in different disciplines. So your university has a lot of very creative disciplines represented, and it may be that for your students it would be an absolute abrogation not to send them out with that kind of public digital persona. But I wonder if there's other disciplines where that's not quite so much the case, and there's much more traditional value placed on, the book-based study.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes it's to do with the maturity of a field. In some senses, you could argue that the very concept of a profession is it's something that has very particular structures that you move through or towards. And so if you are going to be an engineer or a quantity surveyor, then the link between what you're doing academically and what that means professionally is much closer together, because these things have matured over in some cases, hundreds of years. But even in those scenarios, I think that if we feel it's important for universities to take on responsibilities for their graduates' employment, I think even in those disciplines that are very mature and very professional in that sense, there's still a feeling that you need to be more than that piece of paper. And so obviously that puts the students in a difficult position, because your comment about perhaps a professionally managed portfolio being of more value than a degree, it depends what you mean by value, because I would argue it isn't of much value unless you've got a degree. So we end up in a scenario where we're really saying, well, you need both. So then the question is, to what extent is the responsibility of the university to ensure that you go out in the world with both? Or to what extent should universities be saying, well, we do this thing really well and it's still really important?
That kind of both-and approach is obviously the nice one to go down, but it takes me a little bit away from the disruption that I'm trying to get us to play with. So
we're agreeing, aren't we?
we're agreeing too much. So agreed, we both need students to encourage students to be creative, to play with the technology, to discover themselves in it, to develop a persona and identity beyond whatever their degree grade is going to represent for them, and we give them a safe space to do that. And we also need to do some of those formal practices to channel them into what's left of the traditional professions. But we could be really radical here. We could say, well, sod professions. Professions are disappearing. These practices are disrupting professions. People are being their own lawyers. They're being their own journalists. Everybody who leaves university and college today is probably going to have 7 to 10 careers. Some of them simultaneously. They're going to be stitching them together with technology. Could universities and colleges really step out in a radical way here and say, we no longer exist to provide a funnel for well-behaved graduate entrance to the professions? We actually exist to challenge, excite, broaden people's minds, create a completely borderless experience they're not going to have anywhere else. I mean, we could push it that way.
Well, my immediate response to that is that's quite intriguing, because when you say, well, we should challenge students and broaden their minds and try and encourage them to have a larger worldview, I'd say yes, and I'd say that the existence of the digital is disruptive in the sense that it gives us the opportunity to do what we said we always were going to do. So we can counter that kind of, right, you're here to, we're putting you in the guide rails for this profession, and then we're going to send you out there, and by the time you hit the job market, your profession won't exist. So I think what happens is that flux, that fluid nature that comes from the idea that you might have more than one job in parallel, exactly as you were saying, means that and the way the digital in a way creates that flux and forces that situation actually reflects back on higher education and should be encouraging us to focus on, well, let's talk about critical thinking. Let's talk about sort of the agile mind. Let's talk about perspective, the broad view. Let's not think about in tray, out tray. Let's not think about rigid process. And for me, that's what a graduate should be, okay? Because otherwise, we're just very expensive training.
Well, absolutely. It may be that as, open accreditation allows more employers and professional bodies to define their own kind of entry terms, if you like, that becomes less obviously what higher education should be about. And it may be that perhaps what digital is pushing us towards is to democratise that previously very elite experience of having time and space to play with ideas, to play with who we can be, to play with how we express ourselves, to play with our identity. I mean, that would be an exciting prospect, wouldn't it?
It is an exciting prospect. I think if we look at it from the student's perspective, when they're paying fees, in actual fact, that puts the kind of privilege back into the system, in that what you're describing, I believe, educationally, is a massive value and a kind of what the world needs, if I can be that broad with it. But in actual fact, if you're a student entering higher education, then that idea of saying, well, this is going to cost me £40,000 and I'm going to spend 3 years playing because I believe that's, this is a massive leap, especially if you're coming out of the traditional sort of school system. That is a huge shift in really that your ideological approach to even what the nature of education is. And so I think if that's going to happen, then it's very much the responsibility of individual tutors and academics to really push that philosophy. And I do think that happens a lot below the sort of corporate surface of, UK University PLC. I think that actually happens quite a lot. I wouldn't like to say, that's all gone. But it's something that you have to fight for. But I honestly believe that the opportunities that the digital puts in front of us to build networks, to create new connections, to not just go out into my hometown and do the job in the whatever single industry was there, or I think that puts us in a situation where we can be very confident that that's how we should be pushing things. But what intrigues me is that we end up in what I think of as an almost ironic situation, whereby what some people would describe as the disruptive nature of the digital, I describe as an opportunity to do what we said we were always doing. So to me, it's incredibly positive, assuming we're brave enough to really take hold of it.
It's a hearts and minds job for students and for employers, isn't it? To persuade them that, employers always say it's the soft skills, it's resilience, it's the capacity to respond to change, it's creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. They always say those are the skills they want to bring into their organisations, and yet find it really difficult to value them when they're presented to them in rich ways.
Well, it's worse than that. I think it's worse than that. I think there's a real dichotomy there, and I think that employers are perhaps really disingenuous with this, in that if you ask them in that kind of pure question way, what do you want? Then they will say, we want people who can think, who can collaborate, who can work in international teams, who understand the web, who understand, etc., etc. And then you look at the job descriptions they put out, and it's a massive list of skills. And it's like, we want you to be able to code, we want you to be able to use 17 bits of Office software, we want you to be able to, know Prince 2, we want you, and all of these things. But also, we want you to be a great team worker, self-starter, etc., etc. So I think that's one problem: is that the formal mechanism of the job market does not actually equate that closely to the kind of attributes that employers know they want at a senior. I think it's the really senior people that understand that. So I think there's a real problem there. It causes an enormous amount of paranoia that I've witnessed among the students, where they say, well, wait a minute, you're telling us that we have to be like, critical thinkers and have these very nebulous skills, and then I go and apply for a job and I've got to tick 58 boxes before I can even get to interview.
I think we tell students all the time, don't we, that they need a public digital profile, and we encourage them to learn openly. We encourage them perhaps to collaborate in borderless spaces. I know there's some really radical things going on at Coventry where students can learn photography in a closed course and an open course kind of simultaneously. But then my experience of talking to students is they feel quite troubled by that, and they don't think it's necessarily what they've signed up for. They think they've signed up for somewhere that they can kind of practice these identities until they're really polished and nuanced, and then they go out and sort of present them to the world at the end of year 3 or whatever it is. And we do have a struggle there, don't we? Because equally, institutions, universities want their students to look really great, and they don't necessarily want their students falling over themselves in the first year and putting all that on the internet and saying, well, this is the best our students can be. So there are hearts and minds jobs there about the degree of borderlessness that we can encourage, aren't there?
Yes, and I think that part of the problem is that if I can include you in this, Helen, that people like us are quite quick to say, hey, don't worry about having a perfect idea or having that totally honed, put that out there in the world. And, and then the discourse will come around that, and the digital will become the place where the knowledge is pushed forward, and you can be part of that, and you'll learn from that, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's a beautiful thing, okay? But we know the tools of the trade. I think sometimes we can be at fault of not equipping our students with almost like the tools of the knowledge trade or before we throw them out there.
But it was ever thus, wasn't it? I mean, since the year dot, university tutors have been writing on undergraduate essays, be more critical, show your sources, poor argument, and undergraduates have been going, well, what does that mean? I mean, we were never very good as a profession at explaining what we mean by academic discourse or professional discourse. And, it may just be that the digital gives us better tools to exemplify some of that.
Yes, but I think that what you're saying is interesting in the sense that, coming back on some of the other things we've been discussing, I think that now there's a new context that the web brings, and I think perhaps it's not new, but perhaps it's amplified. I think that puts us in a position where we actually have to be more explicit about what the nature of higher education is and what the value of it is and what the process is. I think sometimes too much of that remains implicit. So your induction to your university will be how to get into the library. Do you know what I mean? But it won't necessarily be, here's what the point of your higher education is. And higher education institutions have very nebulous what is Rome concepts of that. And incoming students have very fixed and quite often extremely conservative views of that. And I wonder whether there needs to be a more open conversation around those areas about, what is the role and the value of higher education, because you predominantly have students bringing in a kind of, it's like school but harder. And then you have higher education institutions that are either taking we're going to prepare you for work, or it's a sort of more truth and beauty. But these somehow, somewhere in those discussions aren't had. And in coming back to that idea of what do we do with student practices that are perhaps in grey areas or that they want to keep hidden from their institution for whatever reason, I think the answer to that is you try to convene a discussion about the fact that they exist and what the value and role of those kind of skills or competencies or approaches are in the context of the formal part of their education. So you don't, as an institution, you don't try and own them. You don't necessarily say, well, they're all bad or they're all good. But you do at least say, hey, some of that stuff that you're doing out there, that's fine. That's part of what it means to do a higher education. It's not a problem. And here are some of the kind of transitional points, or here's some of the bridges whereby those practices link across to practices that we'll talk about in this lecture room, or we'll talk about in the context of the formal.
I think graduate students are really valuable in that space, aren't they? I mean, I've worked with amazing graduate students who are becoming expert in their discipline, but who also have that kind of vocabulary of apps, of skills, of collaborative practices that they're often injecting into quite well-established research teams. And I think, we miss a trick if we don't allow those conversations to happen. And also, the graduate students I've worked with say, well, the 17, 18-year-olds coming in have all sorts of practices around animation, coding, gaming that we just have no idea about. It's changing that fast. Yeah. So there's, going back to the tradition of the academy being a community of scholars, where we need to value some of those skills that our graduate students and our arriving students have in the digital space and really help them to bring out what is academically and professionally credible, what's academically and professionally disruptive, but I guess in the true tradition of radical pedagogy, take the disruption on the chin.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think just be honest about it existing. And I think where it falls down is where we fall back into this trap of trying to create a hard edge to disciplines, or trying to sharpen or put into focus the edge of the institution and say, well, these practices are inside or sort of authentic, and these practices are outside and a little bit scary, and we can't really quantify how credible they are, and to kind of forget that, and to say, well, the web's everywhere, people are learning all over the place in different ways, and what we need to do is we need to stand back and look at them in terms of overall value, rather than legitimacy through an institutional lens.
It does take a lot of confidence, though. It takes a lot of confidence, though, as an educator and an educational institution to do that, just as it takes a lot of confidence as a student.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the real challenges is the very nature of an institution is the systemization of something. And what I've just described is almost the opposite. But we can see over the course of time, and we know that this is what happens, is that the radical practices gradually get drawn into and become systematized, and there's this cycle. I think that with digital practices, that cycle is sometimes so fast we don't see it take place. I think the real danger is that sometimes that cycle is taking place, but within the student body and nowhere else. And so I know of practices that, if you like, have disappeared into use with the students before the institution even knew they existed. And then you end up with a scenario whereby you have the learning provider not actually having a good sense of how the students are learning. And that's where it becomes a problem. And I think that's why you have to take this broad view and say, none of it's terrifying. It might be disruptive, but it's not destructive. And we need to come to an understanding of these practices that are constantly evolving. And the only way we're going to do that is we need this sense of permanent inquiry into what it means to learn.
Well, I think permanent inquiry into what it means to learn is a great note to kind of capture. My sense, though, and it's interesting, it picks on what you've just said, my sense of how disruptive technology per se can be is that is diminishing. It's partly what you said about the sort of cycle of adoption within the student body is so fast, and the cycle with which the institutions can reify those practices is inevitably slower. So, by the time we've got it all shiny and ready to go, the students have it's old hat. And I also think that some of these things we're talking about are invisible to students. That and I know when you try and talk to students about technology, they kind of go, "Where? What's that? What's that technology?" Because it is literally, attached to their person. Yeah. It's not visible. The practices are invisible, and some of what we're doing in higher education surely has to be to kind of make visible again some of what's become naturalised, which might actually mean going backwards rather than going forwards into more disruption. It might actually be going, where are the values around which this disruption can make sense, or, the technology as Trojan horse is less powerful than it used to be.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of things in there. I mean, one of them is that idea of sort of, I think of it as reaching in and making certain things visible again is really important, and encouraging, if not forcing, students to reflect on their own practices, but their own practices in the broadest possible sense. Not their own practices that they do in formal contexts, but I mean across the board, which is quite a difficult thing to encourage. I think that's really crucial, and I think that's a really important role for the institution to do. And that's where I think of us moving from the digital to the post-digital. That disappearance of practices puts us in the post-digital, whereby people, I've interviewed students and said, how do you go about researching? And they struggle to answer, and they go, are you talking about Googling? Because they can't imagine anything else. And I was just reflecting on the fact the other day that how some people get annoyed with the catalogue system in the library. Well, that's because there's a generation of students that don't remember using a physical card catalogue. So they don't remember how much better it is because their entire context is digital. But I think what it comes back to, because I wouldn't want us to imagine that new is new is new. And I think that that it's important to recognise that sometimes new software, new modes of engagement are just a kind of skin over old practices. And that's why, as learning institutions, we need to be really confident and say it sort of doesn't matter how you're doing it or what you're doing it with, but we're about broadening worldview, we're about critical thinking, critical evaluation, moving forward knowledge. We're about, helping you learn how to learn, helping you learn how to think. These are fundamental. These don't change. And what I wouldn't want us to be kind of promoting is the idea that we've got to run around like crazy people, making sure we understand everything that's new. Because when you abstract what's going on pedagogically and when you abstract what's going on epistemologically, essentially, quite often it's the same.
Yeah.
And
no, I would agree.
It saddens me when I see institutions lack confidence in the core of their mission, which can be expressed or facilitated through the digital, but which isn't the digital itself.
And it may be in the digital age that what institutions uniquely are offering stands up more clearly. I mean, certainly students are voting with their feet for experiences which are not the digital diploma mill, but which are often a co-located community of scholars, are often the kind of face-to-face encounter with experts, even if it's in a large lecture hall, which we kind of have decried for so many years. So I think you're right that the unique offer that higher education makes kind of looks different in a digital age, even if it's a very traditional offer. That the meaning of that traditional offer has to change, doesn't it? Given that there are these digital alternatives, and I agree. What's great is when you can work with staff to understand that those values and that offer can be expressed through digital technology, through digital media, through disruptive practices, actually.
Yeah, and exactly that, disruptive practices. So, for example, sometimes we get it the wrong way around in terms of we don't recognise what's disruptive as well as assuming the new is disruptive. So, for example, encouraging the students to work in a more open way, open practice, say blogging, being more visible with their thoughts, being more visible with the process behind what gets them to the finished product that they hand in, that is massively disruptive. Hugely counterculture, really unusual, quite distressing. Okay, but it doesn't require anything other than the web as to create audience and to create visibility. Do you see what I mean? You don't need the latest app to do that. You don't need the latest tablet computer to do that. So the practice is disruptive, which is facilitated by the digital. And I've seen scenarios, pedagogically, whereby it's almost as if the people who have designed those teaching moments have imagined that because they're using a new blogging platform, that's what makes it disruptive, rather than actually saying, hey, students, tell me what you think about this before you hand the essay in.
I've also seen students protesting mightily at university spending on shiny digital kit because they don't feel that that's investing in what they value. And that's not a Luddite mentality. That's actually often coming from students who are incredibly digitally knowledgeable and knowing what they do. So, well, this isn't what I would invest in, because although it looks shiny and new, actually it's not supporting a better learning experience. It's not been well thought about. I mean, it's quite radical when students take that approach.
And I think that's because, we are sort of more post-digital than digital. So the students now already own all that shiny technology. 15, 20 years ago, you'd go to university to encounter that shiny technology. And so I think we've got over that hurdle, I'm very glad to say, and that we now, there's more clarity in recognising that owning cool stuff doesn't get you very far. When we say we're interested in disruption, we have to question very closely what we mean by that, and whether what we're doing is actually disruptive or whether it just has the appearance of newness, and we assume that newness is disruptive. Whereas you could argue in technology, as it's become domesticated and it's become more of a consumer item, that newness has actually become just this kind of an extension of consumerism, and disruption should be questioning that.
Absolutely, and I think sometimes disruptive practice comes along when technologies are quite well embedded, actually. That's the point at which people realise what they can do with them. That's completely different.
Well, and that's what you're describing, or that's how I see what you're describing as reaching in and bringing it back out again. And saying, actually, we're going to do something really radical with pedagogy, and we're using email. Perfectly possible. And I think sometimes the technology that has disappeared or has become mundane is the ideal conduit for doing something really disruptive, because people don't have that sort of veil of newness pulled over their eyes, and they can really see the practice for what it is, because the technology is completely transparent and quite dull. So I think there's massive opportunities there, and the people that I see that are doing sort of counter internet pedagogies and things like that are quite often almost deliberately quite retroactive in the technologies they choose, because then you don't get this kind of arms race of coolness, if you like, that completely destroys any sense of disruption. And of course, we have this massive history of technology that we can now reach down into. There's enormous richness there potentially for us.